Good morning. My name is Raj Shah. I'm in the School of Foreign Service, and I most recently served as the administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development here in the Obama administration in Washington, D.C. for almost 6 years. Have now been at Georgetown for about 6 months, and I'm delighted that Professor Richardson was kind enough to invite me to participate in this conference. Just so I get a sense of the room here, how many of you are Georgetown students and faculty, and how many are visiting from elsewhere? Well, let me ask the question first. How many are Georgetown faculty or students? Good. Oh, good. Okay, great turnout. And how many are from elsewhere? Good. Excellent. Excellent. And then also, how many are primarily studying or participating in the field of philosophy? Henry. Good. And how many are development students or in that area? Oh, good. Okay. Well, it's good to be with you. I was originally wondering if there was some deep philosophical reason why everybody was sitting on this side of the room, but I will retract implied meaning since it's a lot of development students. I would like to share a few thoughts, maybe as opening comments this morning, on some of the trends and experiences that I've had and the trends that I think will help transform this field. And then, frankly, I look forward to a very open and engaged discussion with you and to learn a little bit from you about what you are thinking about and experiencing as you participate in this work. There are 2 or 3 opening comments I'd make, though, before jumping into a few slides and case studies. The first is, I really do believe we are at a unique point in our history from the perspective of global development. In my view, this is a field that has been professionalized really only after World War II and has slowly evolved. Perhaps it could evolve faster, especially as you all participate in the work and the challenges ahead. And the field always had an objective desire to help nations grow, to move people out of poverty, to create the basis of a global economy that was integrated and had some element of fairness or justice built in. And today, for the first time, I believe it is possible to look forward and actually see the end of extreme poverty, to see the end of children dying from simple preventable diseases, to see the end of children suffering from a deep level of malnutrition and acute and painful and debilitating hunger. And it's not just that that's a rhetorically nice objective function for us to all aspire towards. It is actually that if you look statistically, we've now gotten to the point where the combination of growth, trade, investment, importantly science and technology, and our own knowledge of how to tackle and solve global problems has achieved a level of robustness that we can credibly and honestly make these claims. If you look at the number of people, probably about 1.1 or 1.2 billion people around the world that live at $1.25 of income each day, and maybe 2 billion or 2.5 billion that live under $2 a day in income. That is the population that today houses most of what at least I think of as deep injustice when it comes to human vulnerability. That's the population where children are quite vulnerable and often don't survive until the age of, to the age of 4 or 5. That's the population that accounts for nearly all of the world's hunger and extreme suffering from malnutrition. That's the world that still effectively lives in the dark, with probably half of that population not having access to power and electricity, which we take for granted and is so critical to being part of the modern economy. And if you just look statistically at projections forward, it is entirely possible, if we make the right decisions and if we do the most creative and effective things as leaders and participants in this work over the next 2 decades, that by 2030 or 2035, the number of people in that population of 1.1 billion will go down to under 200 million around the world. And when you compare that to population projections of around total global population of 9 billion, that's a prevalence of extreme poverty and suffering that starts to get under 2 to 3%. And that is what we define as the end of extreme poverty, the end of preventable child death, the end of suffering from hunger and malnutrition, and the end of vulnerability to the kinds of disasters and catastrophes that I will illustrate in the next few examples. So I hope as you participate in this field, but also as you think about the next few days, when through this conference you'll be part of these exciting debates about human capabilities and what constitutes a basic set of human characteristics that we should nurture and support in all people, that you do keep in mind that we're having that discussion and that debate at a very particular time in our history, where just in the last 5 to 10 years, the trend lines have accelerated such that if we continue on that pace, we can actually end the kind of suffering that we see around the world that, at least for me, inspired a career in this work, and that I suspect for some of you inspires a renewed level of dedication every time you touch or talk to a child who otherwise would live in those circumstances. When I started at USAID, I had, in my first week on the job, the earthquake that destroyed Port-au-Prince, Haiti, took place. Actually, it was a Thursday evening, and it was an extraordinary moment because in just a few minutes, hundreds of thousands of people were at risk of losing their lives and lost their lives. A city of almost 2 million people was largely decimated. And the largest humanitarian response ever mounted needed to be marshaled to address the consequences of what people saw. And from the perspective of this conference and the next couple of days, the other part that I became more aware of in leading the U.S. response to the Haiti earthquake was that maybe not for the first time, but certainly in a very powerful way, a lot of American families saw that just 2-hour flight from Miami puts you in a place where people lived in a level of circumstance and vulnerability that seemed inappropriate, that seemed unjust, and people wanted to do something about it. In fact, more American families had some direct participation in the response to the Haiti earthquake than gather to watch the Super Bowl on an annual basis, which, how many of you are Americans? You know that that's a big deal. So it shows in my mind that our population and our country has a deep capacity to recognize and respond to concepts like justice and fairness when they have the opportunity to see and touch and potentially resolve what they perceive as injustice. Within a few days, we'd actually mounted an extraordinary response that pulled hundreds of people out of the rubble and saved a number of lives, several hundred lives. And it was an extraordinary experience because 56 different countries had contributed what are called urban search and rescue teams. And in that moment of crisis, getting countries, political leaders, church groups, humanitarians to put in resources and effort and creativity was fairly easy. People were motivated to do something to end what they saw as injustice and to serve those who they saw as suffering. Sustaining that effort over time, of course, is much, much harder. These types of crises disappear from the public view, and people go back to a much more complacent view of the world around them. This is a photograph I took last December in a hospital we created as part of the reconstruction effort in Port-au-Prince. And these are photos of young babies that have been born prematurely and are getting special services in an effort to reduce the rate of neonatal mortality and under 5 child mortality and infant mortality. Since the Haiti earthquake, the rate of infant mortality and the rate of under 5 child mortality in Haiti is down 25%. The rate of the number of children who go hungry is down 50%. The number of children who are deeply malnourished is down 50% in terms of micronutrient malnutrition. Agricultural product and yields are up 200 to 300%. And Haiti's actually had now 4 or 5 consistent years of 4.8, 4.9, 5.0% GDP growth, driven in large part by a tripling of foreign direct investment into the country. It is easy, and you will hear throughout your careers, that change is generational. And that is absolutely true, whether it's building institutions or seeing the fruits of these labors actually play out at the homes and families of people you serve. But the reality is, when we put our mind to it, and this was a situation where we got a lot of extra resources, we brought some of the world's best leaders and thinkers to help do the best they could in a difficult circumstance, you can make a tremendous difference quickly. And in fact, that's why the number of children who die from malaria today is cut in half relative to 10 years ago. That's why the number of people on AIDS drugs today is 15 million, when it was almost nothing 10 years ago. That's why most of the lower middle income countries in the world are continuing to grow at 5, 6, 7% and are accelerating the path of people out of poverty. And I just want you to remember throughout the debates of the next few days and things you'll hear in the next several years that accelerated and intense effort can absolutely make a huge difference quickly. And it's really important that, especially those of you that are going into this field, never forget that, because that's our core purpose, and it's what our core purpose should be. A few years after the Haiti earthquake, we started to get signals in East Africa that 17 to 19 million people would be at risk of severe food insecurity. We were getting these signals in March, April, and May of 2011. And the signals, when I call them signals, they're actually just weather predictions of low rainfall coupled with market assessments of food availability, coupled with our own understanding and modeled impact of a group called Al-Shabaab, which is, as you know, a terrorist group in Somalia, and what their governance challenges and what the fact that they didn't allow humanitarian workers into certain areas would do if the drought in this context continued into the fall. And I had an opportunity to visit that summer the Dadaab refugee camp, which housed at the time about 440,000 people, many of whom had walked from Somalia almost 60, 70, 80 kilometers into Kenya in order to seek safety and protection and food and services. And I was talking to this family, this mother and that young child on the left with, who was getting fed through a nasogastric tube because he was so deeply malnourished that he had a hard time taking in food, and he was being slowly resuscitated with modern and improved feeding techniques. And frankly, I was so focused on this child that it didn't even occur to me until after I had asked the mother some questions through an interpreter that morning her other son had died and was on the cot wrapped in a cloth, sari, as you can see. And again, it's just a reminder that in 2011, our world was letting these children die, essentially of a lack of access to food at time of crisis. And you can say, well, you know, of course nobody wants that to happen. And we, in this context, knew it was coming as a famine. We had all of our humanitarian partners lined up. We had plenty of money. Money was not a problem, billions of dollars, to do something about it. We even had partnerships with the intelligence community and the military communities that allowed us to understand what was going on inside terrorist-controlled parts of Somalia. But frankly, we just didn't have enough precise data to know exactly where is a particular child going to be vulnerable, exactly which household or which community or which food market is going to experience a 400% or 500% spike in food prices that ultimately leads to this kind of absolutely disastrous outcome. Had we known that, we can solve the problem. This may not look like advanced technology. This is just an extraordinarily adorable kid getting Plumpy Nut, which some of you might know is a peanut-based paste that is very nutritious. Children can take it in, and within 2 to 3 weeks of intensive and medically supported feeding with these specialized advanced food products, you can resuscitate the child you saw on the last slide to look like this young boy. But it takes some effort and it takes targeting. And despite having generalized data about weather predictions and everything else, we didn't have household level information about vulnerability. Once we started to collect household level information, and I could go in more creatively about how we actually did it, once we started to get that data and information, we were able to make a huge difference. The top curve here represents what we call the excess mortality of the famine of 2011. The bottom line is, unfortunately, what we call the standard level of under 5 child mortality. So the area under the curve represents the 35,000 children who died during this crisis. And the peak of that mountaintop, 2 things happened there. The first was we developed a method for putting people inside markets in Somalia, giving us information about household level vulnerability, which households are most likely to be vulnerable and to suffer. And the second is we worked with a very creative program through UNICEF that got vouchers and electronic payments to those households so that they could then go and secure food and services and support, often using mobile phones. The difference in mortality became apparent immediately. And one of the things that I have become very focused on is I believe it is possible for us to make a reasonable investment. That may be hundreds of millions or tens of billions. Either way, it would be reasonable in the grand scale, and build the kind of system that would allow us to understand real-time actionable data on which households are vulnerable during crises, and frankly, when crises are not as immediate, but we still have the goal of ending extreme poverty. And I believe a whole new set of tools, from aerial satellite photography coupled with mobile phone-based data collection, coupled with improved ability to do data mining on things like Google and Facebook search criteria, can help you pinpoint and identify when crisis is going to lead to disaster, or when disease is going to lead to epidemic and pandemic, and can allow us to prevent that well ahead of time. And that became really clear to me during the Ebola epidemic of last year. For those of you with philosophy backgrounds, I do not have that, but I have a heightened sense after experiencing the West African Ebola crisis of right and wrong. And at times of crises like HIV 10 years ago and Ebola today even, people who are suffering are often seen, and they are, seen as vectors of transmission and cause fear. They live in a world of deep stigma. And you can see this young man suffering from Ebola, being cordoned off for the safety of others, but also being left to die in an environment where we did not have the capacity to mount a response to this crisis fast enough. 11,000 people ultimately died from the crisis in West Africa on Ebola, and it obviously became a pandemic threat to the rest of the world. When we organized ourselves to respond, again, we were able to do so quickly and effectively. This is a photograph of the burial teams. We deployed more than 60 of these burial teams in Liberia alone, more than 90 in Sierra Leone, about 60 or 70 in Guinea. And these teams would go to the sites where people were dying or had passed. And because so much of the transmission, 70%, was from family members hugging, kissing, and washing the bodies of the deceased, they would, after engaging with communities, effectively remove the bodies of the deceased and have a dignified burial that was safe for family. We deployed science and technology, advanced diagnostics and biocontainment and protective equipment in order to optimize the response and the relief effort. And this is actually me trying to get in and out of protective equipment in Sierra Leone. In addition to training thousands of health workers on how to use protective equipment, we actually redesigned the basic protective equipment suit in order to optimize and accelerate the response and prevent death of health workers, which was a huge problem that was decimating our capacity to serve others. I highlight this because, again, when a crisis is visible and people feel it, it is relatively easy to get the world to be creative and motivated in tackling it. To do this redesign, we actually rented out a maker space, which I had not known what that was before we rented it, in Virginia, in Arlington. And we had folks from Motorola and DuPont and the CDC, DARPA, every agency and many of the companies you can name come together for 2-3 days and conduct a process of creatively trying to redesign the equipment for the purpose of a West African Ebola response, and it was highly successful. Again, taken together, you can see what happens when the world gets its energy up to solve a problem. This is the prevalence chart of Ebola in West Africa, and you can see the spike in number of cases in September, October, November. Around September is when President Obama and a group of us went down to CDC in Atlanta and really deeply accelerated the response to the Ebola crisis. We got on the phones, we called the heads of state and ministers from 30, 40 countries around the world, raised billions of dollars, got hundreds of medical professionals to go into this setting and massively scaled the response, including bringing in the United States military to do some specialized tasks. The effect of that kicked in 6 to 8 weeks later, but once it took hold, you can see how absolutely rapidly and effectively the Ebola crisis was beaten. And I say was beaten even though there are a few cases left in West Africa, and it's still work that has to be completed, because while it's a problem in some places, it is no longer a threat to the rest of the world. And it's also no longer a destabilizing threat to the countries in the region in question. And so I will leave you with the thought that the problems we encounter and the things you may end up discussing through this capabilities conference, debates about what people's basic human rights are and should be, I think ought to be informed by some of the lessons learned through these experiences. One lesson is when more people who are not aware of the way people live around the world gain that awareness, whether they are college kids with iPhones or church group leaders that want to donate or support a response, it brings out in us a basic human desire to support and prevent injustice, which is what I believe extreme poverty and vulnerability effectively is. The second lesson learned is when the world gets motivated to solve these problems, it actually can solve them rapidly and effectively. And that, I think, is the most important thing for us to continue to remind ourselves, because so many people believe that it's not solvable. I think they believe it because it's a protective mechanism. If something is not solvable, then I don't really have to worry about, am I doing something to solve it? It's fundamentally not solvable. That's just not true. There's 6.5 million children will die under the age of 5 this year. By 2030, if we do our jobs right, less than 1 million children will die of these same basic diseases. These are solvable problems, but it takes effort, it takes motivation, it takes a belief that you can do something about making sure people have the capabilities you'll be discussing in the next several days. And to me, the third big lesson, at least for me personally, is that data is everything. And so I hope, even though this is a philosophy conference, that Richard, you and others have brought in some data folks, because at the end of the day, if we can't see what we're trying to solve at a granular and real-time level, we're going to be shooting in the dark collectively. And the tools, technology, companies, and creativity exists to visualize human suffering and human vulnerability in a way that helps us solve it more effectively. And that, to me, is ultimately what our collective task is all about. So thank you for the opportunity to share those comments. I look forward to your questions and your comments and any observations as we go forward. But thank you very much.
Jean-François Toigny, Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. One thing I think is missing, if I may say so, is the political aspect of things. Every crisis that you nominated, every time, was it Haiti, the Somalia crisis that I know less, or Ebola crisis a few years ago, the main problem with the international community and with the West countries is that we react very late. We don't consider the importance of a crisis. Look at the migrants crisis in Europe these days. And therefore, the response, even if we do have the capacity, and I agree with you, USAID is bringing a lot of resources every time they decide to go. But in the meantime, people are dying. We don't do the minimum to save lives. And years go by before there is either media sudden information that gets the public opinion in the streets, or we have more reaction to it. Until then, nothing happens. So I think what we need to tell the students who will go in this field is that there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of waiting time before we become effective. And it's not a technological problem, it's a political issue. Thanks.
Thank you. I agree with your comment. You know, if you look at these charts, they all look the same, right? This is the Ebola crisis. If you go back to the Somali famine, you know, it's not that we didn't know in January, February, March of this year that this crisis was coming. I would say, and I had a role where a lot of my job was to build that political support for a response. You know, generalized concern is hard to build political support around. Specific identifiable problems that have specific identifiable solutions is much easier to build political support around. So I think one of the tasks we have to take your comment and act on it is to say, okay, how do we have enough knowledge and visibility in January, February, March to be able to say 35,000 kids are about to die. We know where those kids are. We know how to solve this problem. We know how to prevent it. If we do what we normally do, we'll end up spending billions of dollars too late. And we'll be successful, but only after a whole lot of suffering. If we do what we can do now because of data, technology, early warning, rapid action, we can spend 1/10 that amount of money and prevent the catastrophe to begin with. That's the mindset I think we have to take, not just, by the way, on disaster response, which is what a lot of these examples are about, but the fight against malaria, the fight against under 5 child mortality, the fight against food and hunger deprivation, the effort to bring electricity to 550 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have it, 300 million people in South Asia that don't have it. Those are urgent priorities we need to resolve now to prevent the next set of disasters, because the vulnerability is in those basic populations that live in extreme poverty.
Thank you, Professor Shah, for your excellent comments and, of course, the great work that USAID had been doing under your leadership. I have a comment to make, followed by a question, that relates to the earlier question, which is that poverty, underdevelopment, and even disasters, they don't happen overnight. You know, they take a long time to happen, and there is a long history to it. As Gore Vidal once said of the United States of America, that it's United States of amnesia. You know, we have very short memory of our culpability and what exactly is leading into all these things. And so we have to think of aid and humanitarian efforts, not in terms of kindness and charity, but our special obligation in view of our role in underdeveloping Africa and these poor countries through the past historical processes and all that. Haiti is an example. Studies have shown that rich countries have 1/10 of the bad effects of a disaster like that during an earthquake than poor countries, especially like Haiti. They have no ways to cope with it, you know. But Haiti had been kept poor throughout history for some historical and political reasons. So we have to look back and take a look at ourselves first and see that it's not just a charity, it's an obligation. We have to be more proactive rather than being reactive when some disaster happens. So, and the question then is, of course, how to get that going, you know, that awareness. And you made some interesting comments along that line, but I would like to hear a bit more on that from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me make an observation about your comment. I'm very pragmatic, so if a sense of guilt helps to motivate action, I'm all for it. On the other hand, I have, in my experience, I've seen that particularly political leaders are often, and corporate leaders and folks with resources, are often more motivated about the practical outcomes that can be achieved. So for example, when you make the case that to agricultural industry leaders that 65% of the world's arable land that has not been cultivated and brought into productive use is in sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, you should start investing now because 10 years from now, you know you're going to be in a deeply supply-constrained agricultural world, and you want to, you know, participate in that economic solution early so you can participate late when it's going to have real value. That argument has helped us bring $8 to $10 billion of foreign direct investment into African agriculture, led to an increase in GDP growth rates in the ag economy in these countries of 4 or 5% increase over where it was. And in my view, accelerated rural development as a result of that kind of effort. And those folks are never going to be motivated by a sense of guilt or history. It's just practical problem solving. Similarly, I believe we have 8 million kids in school, 3.5 million are girls in Afghanistan. You know, if as we draw down American troops, if we draw down our support for those girls, Afghanistan is going to someday become a much bigger security problem for the U.S. and will require our troops to go back in. I would much rather, you know, when I'm talking to the political folks who care about our national security, make the case that it is cheaper to do development than to send soldiers. It's not something I say, it's something Secretary Bob Gates said regularly in Congress and in the public media. So I just believe we got to, everyone in this field, motivated by philosophy or development or whatever, you got to make part of your job description getting other people to care and engage. And in my view, it helps to be pretty agnostic as to whatever the tools are that will get them in the game. In terms of how do you take this forward kind of operationally, I would just note, I think there's a strong convergence now around how to do development work effectively. You know, focus on results, measure and understand whether something is working or not, move resources to those that are pragmatic and effective. Be open to technology and innovation because the great proliferation of mobile connectivity has really transformed the face of human poverty and how people who are poor live. And I think one of the things Amartya Sen, who obviously is speaking at this conference and whom you know well, taught many of us through his writings, was that governance is as important to the development pathway as our kind of basic approach to getting people basic human needs. And all of that comes together to create a pretty clear roadmap for the way forward. And in my view, it's about can we live up to what we know is effective.
Thank you, Raj, for a wonderful talk. I was particularly struck by the slide of illustrating the measurement of vulnerability of Somali households. And I want to pick up exactly on this point of governance, and it's sort of the flip side of Professor Chatterjee's question, which was talking about U.S. responsibility for, or complicity in some of the structural injustice that Jean-François had highlighted. But the most striking thing to me in your slide was that it's we, the United States, has this capability, I guess, to mine the data, to use the satellites to predict the weather, to track al-Shabaab. Somalia is an extreme case of a failed state. They clearly didn't have the capacity to do that. But governance, and Sen's work is connected with agency more generally, that people need to take responsibility, be active for their own lives, to be agents of their own lives. And in promoting governance, we need to be able to promote other countries being able to do these kinds of things themselves. And I just want to invite you to talk more about how can we spread this kind of ability from USAID and the U.S. government, which has tremendous capabilities, more broadly around the world, so that people in East Africa can start predicting their own droughts themselves.
Well, thank you, Henry, and I appreciate that point, because I sometimes run the risk of making all this seem like it's just USAID that has these tools and technologies, and that's really not the case. I mean, if you look at, Bangladesh is a good example. If you look at the rate of reduction of infant mortality and neonatal mortality in Bangladesh over the last 7 years, it's twice as fast a rate of reduction as India has experienced for that element of public health. And then you ask yourself, well, why? And the answer is Bangladesh has been proactive about bringing together mobile connectivity to pregnant women and sending them text messages about making sure they get antenatal checkups and are getting appropriate messages about nutrition. The microcredit movement in Bangladesh over decades has built a level of connectivity to lower income women who are so much part of the solution that you can reach them and participate and get them financial resources, including taxi cab vouchers so that they can, or bus fares so they can go see a doctor in that point in time. Bangladeshi doctors have kind of improved a couple of key interventions, including something called chlorhexidine, which is a little ointment that is simple and easy and now produced there for other parts of the world, including in Nepal. You rub it on the umbilical cord of a baby and it reduces infection risk. So a lot of the solutions, those are solutions that are never going to come from the US medical environment for a million reasons. They're certainly not expensive enough or profitable enough for US companies to focus on, but you're seeing that take hold in places like Nepal and Bangladesh. So I agree with, I think both the capacity to understand vulnerability and the solution sets are going to come from the places where people are increasingly empowered to take control of their own destiny. The question I'd have for you is a little bit more, I wonder what all this means for our judgments about people's responsibilities to take, to advocate for their own rights. And at the end of the day, Sen's work on development as freedom was very significant in my own understanding of what development was all about. And at the end of the day, I really do believe that the lack of governance, coupled with the proliferation of technology, coupled with the capacity of people to resolve their own problems, has resulted in some extraordinary examples of progress where governance remains poor at a state level, but at a very local, personal, household, and business model level, we've seen tremendous advancements in the human condition. I think Bangladesh is a good example of that. It's probably the second most corrupt country in the world, depending on how you measure it's in absolute dollars. It's always hard to beat Nigeria, but if you kind of control for just level of wealth that there is to steal, then I think Bangladesh is probably the most corrupt country in the world that's a real country with a government in a larger place, so not counting as Somalia or South Sudan. And nevertheless, they've had this rapid advancement in welfare for very poor families and women and girls in particular over the last 10 to 15 years. And that didn't come from better governance. It came from people taking a hold of their own destiny with tools and strategies and business models and financing and all of the creative things that have happened there. So you'll have to educate me later on all of that. I'm fascinated by that concept.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today. I'm Marion. I'm one of the new students in the Global Human Development Program.
Welcome.
So we're all very excited to learn a lot more from you. But I wanted to get your insight on something that came up yesterday in Dean Hellman's talk about how the fact that most of the extreme poor are going to be in fragile states is posing a big challenge to the development architecture as a whole. So let's take USAID, for example. That still follows an architecture where there is some form of collaboration with the government to be able to work with them. There's enough safety for the development workers to go in and do their work. But how can we change that architecture so that we can go into places like Yemen and Syria now, where development is important, not just the humanitarian aspect? Thank you.
Well, that's an outstanding question. What did you do before you got here?
I was in Iraq. I was working in a university, setting up a think tank, but got pulled into refugee camps.
Got it.
So, yeah.
I think, Joel, Dean Hellman's comments and your observations are sort of the central challenge going forward. I'm just less pessimistic about all of it, and here's why. If you look at the number of countries that sort of, if you took extreme poverty and mapped it around the world 10 years ago, it was broadly gauged. Lots of countries, lower middle income and lower income and fragile were part of it. Big populations in rapidly growing middle income countries like India, China, Brazil were accounted for a lot of that. If you do the same mapping from, say, the end of this decade onward, the problem set has narrowed so dramatically that you're effectively talking about 10 to 12 relatively large failed states. And I'd count northern Nigeria as a failed state in that context, right? A place inside a proper country, but where there's very poor governance. The challenge is, can the world concentrate effort and come up with new ways of working in that smaller, more focused subset of places to deliver the kind of progress and success we've seen elsewhere in those settings? And I don't think anyone has the answers yet. I'd point out that, you know, the United States as a nation has been criticized for having what some would call an overly political or overly militarized distribution of resources in development, right? We're traditionally seen as over-investing in Afghanistan and Pakistan and under-investing in Tanzania and Ghana, relative to, say, the World Bank, which uses the Country Performance Index system to put money where performance and policy and governance is already strong. I actually think going forward, that critique is a big benefit, because our knowledge and capacity of shared effort with military and developmental partners, our presence and willingness to try things in places like Afghanistan during a crisis, during a war, during a kinetic operation, gives us some insights and knowledge that now I think need to become more central. Jim Stavridis, who's the dean, who was the four-star commander of European Command for NATO, and now the dean at the Fletcher School, has talked about a NATO for development, like an operational entity that includes many nations that can go into a Libya when it's in crisis, that can go into a Syria during crisis, that has a basic security capability to put in place some of the basic governance requirements. I don't know if that can work or not, but I would urge that you all as students have the great opportunity in the next year or two to be extraordinarily creative and not to be constrained by the constraints of the folks running these institutions and doing the politics, to come up with solutions that are out of the box like that. And I agree with you that I think we're going to need that kind of out of the box thinking to be successful.
Thank you so much.
Hi. So I'm Ramona. I'm visiting from a university in Germany. Thank you very much for your talk. I would like to follow up on the turning point in history that you described. What is your view on the crises, like on economic and financial crises that we see that divert the attention in countries basically that could provide financial assistance and of course also technical assistance. And then also the social crises, wars and conflicts that create so much suffering, but then also destroy assets a lot on this turning point in history. So what's your view on those crises, on the chances that we take the right decisions and do that effectively?
So I think first, crisis is always an opportunity. So if you look at the largest areas of developmental investment over time, whether it's South Korea or Nicaragua or Nigeria or elsewhere, it has always been at crisis and post-conflict moments where you've seen the biggest level of political engagement and support for a developmental mission. That's just always been true since World War II. So crisis is certainly debilitating. It is also an opportunity, and we have to keep that in mind. With respect to fiscal crises in, I think what you're making reference to, effectively donor countries, I don't really know how to think about that. If you look at levels of official development assistance, they've been about $130 billion pretty steadily over the last decade when you control for inflation and other things. Some countries are pretty good, notoriously good, like the United Kingdom, and they've had big increases through a fiscal crisis. Some countries are notoriously bad, like Italy, and I can just say that now, so I love that. They just, every excuse they can to make cuts, they do, and tend to, have historically not been able to live up to commitments they've made in global contexts. So we just all have to keep the pressure on and use that 130 billion as effectively as we can. But again, keep in mind that that pot of resources should, per the last discussion, increasingly focus on a smaller subset of places. We should be bringing more Middle Eastern partners, South Asian partners, East Asian partners into the fight, so expanding the pool of partners that can resolve this, and increasingly using technology and commercial investment opportunities that are really the underlying drivers of development and have been all over the world once countries kind of get enough regulatory protection in place to be able to receive private capital effectively. So I just remain really optimistic that those are achievable goals. I don't think fiscal crises in developed countries is the determining criteria. If we get our politics right, that this is such a small element of global engagement that a fiscal crisis really shouldn't touch this stuff.
Good morning. Thanks for a great talk. I'm Larry Melniker from New York. You mentioned how if we could get ahead of the curve, we would end up spending a lot less money. So, but at the same time, we're still crisis-driven in what we do, even though it's clearly the much more expensive way to do it. So what are the odds of the political entities, the stakeholders that make these decisions on how to donate and when to donate, are they able to see the cost benefit of doing it before the crisis as opposed to just waiting and responding to the crisis? What are the prospects also of the data analysis and the specificity that you spoke about of helping them to better visualize that cost benefit?
Well, those are great questions, and my answer is inspired a little bit by your tie. I read he's wearing an Albert Einstein tie, and I read my kid's book, so it was very easy to read, about the development of the atomic bomb and the race to develop the bomb during World War II. And it is true that it is kind of always crisis that accelerates collective action and performance against goal. Sometimes you have to manufacture a sense of crisis or let people see that a slowly transpiring process like the large-scale, long-term fight against extreme poverty is actually a crisis that we need to deal with. Otherwise, you get lack of stability in places from Yemen to West Africa to elsewhere, right? But in general, if you just take the Ebola crisis as an example, coming out of the Ebola crisis, we will have the largest investment in West African development that's ever been made. We'll have thousands of trained health professionals who are West African individuals who now have basic health training. We will have some diagnostic and epidemiological infrastructure left on the ground that will hopefully be utilized going forward. And while it is entirely possible, and our collective politics has done this over and over and over again, to just let go of that opportunity, if well managed, you can also use the moment to build the kind of public health system throughout West Africa that can ensure that polio does not come back and simultaneously address things like child mortality, maternal mortality in some of the most prevalent and low-performing countries in the world. So, we're always going to have crisis. The question is, do we have political leaders able to use those crises to get the right outcomes? And I would just argue, since so many of the folks raise their hands as development students, I believe part of being a student and participant in the field of development is understanding politics well enough to take advantage of those opportunities. There are too many people who are outstanding development experts that just don't see it in their job description to do the political work required to drive success. And Tony Blair spoke at a session here, the Global Future session, and made the point, I think very convincingly, that development is fundamentally a political process. Amartya Sen made that point, decades ago. And whether that political process plays out through a government or a local council or a group of people taking action as a collective unit in some other setting, I just think it's important that we recognize that and build it into our work. Nice tie, by the way.
Okay. Which one?
I'll go first. Thank you. It's nice to meet an eternal optimistic because I'm the opposite. So I have a question regarding the Ebola crisis. There is some degree of agreement that there was a very late response. I mean, MSF had given warning signs well before the international community responded. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that the
For which crisis? Or all of them?
Ebola crisis? And do you think, the WHO's role has been viewed as, there's been a lot of critique, so do you think that the USAID and the US response was timely or something could have been done differently?
No, everybody involved in this missed the opportunity to prevent Ebola from never being a topic of conversation. And we missed it in, I would say, May, June, early July.
And why do you think?
Well, the reason is, I don't know. I'm actually on this UN panel that's trying to figure this out. But the reality is there was, in March and April, there was there was an Ebola outbreak in the region. It was dealt with. You saw a steep reduction in the number of cases. It looked like the 42 other Ebola outbreaks that have taken place over the last 3 decades. And therefore, a lot of us felt it was running its course. And then there was an epidemiological system in place as a result of that response, but it was weak and non-timely and ineffective. And much like the Somali famine, we were getting kind of generalized, hey, Ebola is a real problem, but not kind of spreadsheets that said this person got positive in this district at this time. And actually, if I go back to that chart, I won't do it, but the effectiveness of the response changed dramatically when we built a data system that was real-time and specific. So actually, this is fun to do. If you look at the top peak here, it wasn't until early November the world was seeing Ebola through the eyes of CDC and WHO that were reporting something called, what were they calling it? They were saying likely confirmed and suspected cases, okay? Which is a technical way of saying what? Maybe people have Ebola, maybe they don't, but this is what we think might be the case. When they switched from that to a system that said Ebola positive in this district on this day. From that point on, the number of cases went down extraordinarily steeply because the response capability was effective, it just the data was terrible. And I would argue the same thing happened back in June and July. I'd argue the same thing happened with the Somali famine. I would argue the same thing is happening today in the large-scale, non-emergency fight to end child death from malaria, to end child malnutrition from basic cycles of hunger. All of these things are fully knowable in real time, but we don't have that kind of data. The world captures information about all of this stuff the way that we captured information about all this stuff 25 years ago. We send survey people out with clipboards, and they collect data, and they come back, and then they do sample surveys, and 3 years later you get oh, Senegal has a child mortality rate of X, and it's 3 years after the fact. And you know, any problem that gets solved because you have real information, you go after it and solve it. And today, in an era where we should be collecting information on mobile phones and confirming it with satellite photography and doing advanced analysis on what people are querying in Facebook and Google, even in these markets, we should have much, much, much more granular and effective information. So anyway, I'm sorry to go on that. I just think, I think that's
And I had two related questions. One is, after this Ebola crisis, we do know that there's been an overfocus on Ebola and that there is an impact on maternal, for example, maternal mortality, and as health systems have become much weaker. So my one question was, is there any data being collected on how this has impacted the other diseases due to the weakening of the health systems? And the other point, maybe coming back to the point of this conference much more as we move to well-being, questions of what constitutes good human life. We do know now that questions like mental health are going to be really central. Even MSF now, all the field staff that they send out, they have to go through psychosocial training. So I was wondering how you think that in a data-oriented world that would be tackled. Thank you.
Yeah. Boy, well, so your first question is easy to answer, that yes, people are collecting that data, but like everything else we do in this field, 3 years from now, someone will spit out an answer, and it will confirm what we already know, which is things are much worse because of Ebola than they were before.
If I may, you said you were looking at WHO epidemiological data. We do know there was some data, and MSF had been, sort of crying out emergency. Are those sources of data that you look at all from the NGOs? Or?
Oh, yeah. I would say, all in. I'm a huge fan of MSF, and I think they conducted themselves with a lot of dignity and courage during this response. The challenge with reading signals from NGOs is that you do have a lot, they're always calling something a crisis, and so genuinely knowing which one is the crisis is tougher. But in this case, they were absolutely justified and accurate in the way they presented the situation. Your second question, I hope, is something that people much smarter than I will elucidate over the next day or two, and that is, it seems to me that we ought to have new ways of understanding, whether people are genuinely happy, satisfied, content. I think sentiment analysis using the mining of Twitter data is something that people in this country use to run successful hedge funds and make lots of money. It strikes me that as a field we ought to figure out how to capture a sense of human welfare that goes beyond the quantitative indicators that I tend to focus on. And I just hope, I know you'll have an extraordinary set of sessions, including a debate between Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. I hope that some of that helps to shed some light on how do modern communications allow us to better understand not just objective criteria of what is a good life or a baseline fair life or a baseline just life, but also practical kind of outcomes data on are people achieving that standard. And actually, Steve Radelet was going to speak here this morning, but he would point out all the things I'm saying about the data when it comes to health and agriculture. He would point out that whether you're looking at the consumer price index or GDP, all of this information is basically modeled best guess kind of stuff. And I don't know, if we were taking a capabilities approach really seriously from a policy perspective, I would argue we would start measuring real human level outcome and sentiment using data against the standards that folks might put forth or not as the standards of what human capabilities mean.
Thank you.
But I'm venturing into a space I do not know, so I'm going to be careful on that front, and maybe we'll just take one or two more if there are a couple.
Hi, thank you for coming here today. It's a great opportunity to learn from you. I am also a new student from Global Human Development Program.
Welcome.
Thank you. I was really intrigued by what you said about data and a lot of things you have already talked about, especially about household data. You mentioned Bangladesh, and yes, it's a lot of the development work that has been going on in Bangladesh is based on the high population density, and the data collection has also been very easier there. I know USAID also do a lot of work in around data in Bangladesh, but what about in other countries where population density is sparse and there are maybe mobile technologies are not there yet, so Twitter, Facebook are not available? What kind of challenges? Is there any challenge in collecting household data in places like those, and what USAID is doing or what can be done in those areas? Thank you.
Well, are you from Bangladesh?
Yes, I am.
Where?
I'm from Dhaka, and on side note, even though the government is very corrupt,
I apologize for my aggressive comments.
I would give them
Only somewhat apologizing.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I would give them the the due. They did allow a lot of organizations to work. That they recognized that they couldn't do all the development work themselves.
Yeah, they've had a good
allow-
track record of enabling others to
Yes.
serve the poor. That's true. Yeah, so I would, I guess, while I agree with the first part of your comment, I would push back a little bit on the point that the technology is not there. I think if you look at places that have, so if you just look broadly, actually, this is a fun story. So the National Geographic every year runs this photo competition. The award-winning photo from last year were Somali refugees that had migrated into Ethiopia. And in the middle of the night, when they were in the midst of this extraordinary trek, they started to get a signal from a nearby mobile network, and they were all like looking up at their phones, and it's like pitch black. They've walked dozens of kilometers. Somehow their phones are lit up, right? And so somehow everything's charged, and they're able to start to connect to the rest of the world, and that's their first instinct. And I have been to the most remote places. I mean, I've been to Abiyan in southern Yemen when President Hadi, who was the president of Yemen, couldn't go, but we could. And everybody had phones. I mean, it was extraordinary. And you can go into the most sparsely populated area in the Sahel in West Africa. Everyone has phones. And they don't all have their phones on all the time, and they're not connected all the time. But they use their SMS texting and everything very, very sparsely, but as necessary. I actually think mobile connectivity is now prevalent throughout the population of the very poor. And I think we have a lot to do to catch up on using that prevalence to collect the data and information on the kinds of stuff I'm talking about and the kinds of things that the folks who are leading this conference will be talking about the next couple of days. Good. Well, is there one more? Okay, great. This will be our...
Thank you so much for a really interesting and very encouraging presentation. Now I'm feeling a bit guilty being the last question, and it's financial in nature. But you mentioned briefly the World Bank allocating resources sort of based on the poverty index, and then how USAID allocates resources. Can you give a little bit more background on kind of how those financial allocation decisions are made, if there are particular thresholds for like the immediacy of the situation or the type of country?
So I used to get asked this question a lot, and I would always say, it is basically whether you're at the bank or in the U.S. government or in a different kind of institution, it's always a combination of data and strategy, right, coupled with politics and reality. And the politics and reality of U.S. aid, for example, is that about a third of the total $22 to $23 billion a year that's allocated is allocated to what I would call national security priorities. And that's high relative to other partners. But again, as I believe that's actually an asset going forward, I think it's been appropriately critiqued kind of 10 years ago. So that may or may not be a full answer, but I'll just come back to the point that I think those of you that are committed to doing something about this work going forward, you have to build both the knowledge base around strategy and data, but you also have to have enough of a political understanding to take advantage of opportunities on behalf of vulnerable people, right? When you use a crisis to get a bunch of extra money from Congress to help accelerate the fight against preventable child death, yeah, you're using politics for good, in my mind. And we shouldn't assume that all political decisions are made in a way that is suboptimal because we've labeled them political. We have to get kind of better at the skill of using political opportunities to serve our ultimate objective, which is achieving some degree of human justice for those who we feel on objective and real data perspectives are not yet experiencing that baseline of fairness. So thank you. So with that, thank you all very much, and good luck for the rest of this conference.